Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a deep dive on Chapter 6 of Dr. Jose Joel Miguiza-Sigsko's book, The Death of Utopia. We're doing what you could call a philosophical autopsy, focusing on some of the most damning arguments against the ideology of the CPP-NPA-NDF. Since this movement has been around for, well, over half a century, it's really time we put its foundational beliefs through a rigorous reality check. So using the framework of the famous philosopher Karl Popper, we're going to see exactly how this revolutionary ideology holds up when tested against actual on-the-ground reality. Let's get right into it. What happens when prophecy collides with facts? It's a devastating question, right? But the author uses this to kick off our exploration. Dr. Eco points out that this insurgency doesn't just hand you a political platform, it's preaching a literal religion of inevitable victory. And honestly, that completely frames the psychological trap that follows. It changes how we understand their internal logic over the last 50 years. Take a look at this. This is the movement's core operating system. The author argues that their foundational promise isn't just that they might win, it's an absolute ironclad guarantee that their revolution is destined to succeed. It's not just a catchy slogan, it's the actual software running the whole operation. And here's the catch. Once a group believes victory is guaranteed by history itself, their entire moral compass shifts. The source notes that if your endgame is historically inevitable and perfectly just, well, then everything else, human lives, ethical boundaries, objective truth, kind of becomes completely negotiable. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll hit 4 main points. 1. The religion of inevitability. 2. Karl Popper's falsification test. 3. Explaining away failure. And 4. The cost of prophecy. Let's move on. Part 1. The religion of inevitability, history according to reality. So how do they justify this absolute certainty? Well, Dr. Egsko points out that the CPP-NPA-NDF leans heavily on this concept called historicism. Basically, through dialectical and historical materialism, they claim their victory is scientifically guaranteed by the fixed laws of history. Imagine you're a new recruit hearing this. It's got to be deeply intoxicating, right? You're being told your struggle literally cannot fail because the outcome is already preordained. You aren't just joining a political group, you're joining destiny. But philosophically, this is incredibly dangerous. It totally absolves the individual of moral responsibility. If the end is fixed and inevitable, you can justify pretty much any action taken to get there.
Part 2. Karl Popper's falsification test, the scientific quiz bee.
Now, how do we actually test if an ideology claiming to be scientific socialism is, actually scientific? This is where the author brings in philosopher Karl Popper. Popper argues that a genuine scientific theory has to take risks. It has to make a specific prediction and say, hey, if X happens, my theory is wrong. It literally has to be willing to be proven false. But a historicist prediction, like the one the author attributes to the CPP, operates totally differently. It basically says, whatever happens, our theory is right. And the book argues that's not science at all. It's a closed prophecy pretending to be science, completely incapable of ever admitting a mistake. Part 3. Explaining away failure, 56 years in the making. Okay, so what actually happens when this prophecy hits the brick wall of reality? Their original theory predicted a very clear timeline. They were supposed to be in the strategic defensive in the 1970s, move to a strategic stalemate in the 80s, and hit the strategic offensive by the 1990s. But look where we are, despite well over 5 decades passing, which is a massive amount of time for any movement. They are still stuck in that very first defensive phase. If you're using a strictly scientific model, a prediction that fails for 50 consecutive years means you absolutely have to revise your model. But they don't revise it. According to the author, the movement survives this half-century of stagnation through what Popper calls a conventionalist twist. Basically, when reality doesn't match the theory, they just bend reality to fit. No mass uprising like they predicted, they don't question the theory, they just say the mass base is weak. Communities actively reject them. Oh, that's just state psy-war. Fighters surrender to the authorities, they insist those surrenders were forced or faked. You see the pattern? The blame is always shifted onto the masses or external circumstances or infiltrators. It's never directed inward. They deliberately avoid admitting that the theory itself might have just completely failed. Every failure becomes proof that the revolution is succeeding. This is a crucial point from the book. By interpreting every single setback as just another step in the grand prophecy, the ideology completely seals itself off from reality. Literally no event is allowed to count as evidence against their theory. It becomes this entirely unfalsifiable belief system.
And the text grounds this massive disconnect in a pretty staggering metric. According to government reports cited by the author, the movement went from 89 active guerrilla fronts in 2016 all the way down to zero. Zero. Under a normal scientific mindset, a collapse of that magnitude would absolutely force an organization to admit their model failed. But an ideology built on historicist destiny, it simply cannot afford to admit error even when the data hits rock bottom. Part 4. The cost of prophecy. When doubt becomes treason. So, what do you do when your prophecy fails but your whole system refuses to admit it? The book outlines this incredibly tragic psychological trap. When your ideology is treated as absolute destiny, questioning it isn't just a strategic mistake. Doubt is treated like an infection. Critics and doubters are inevitably labeled as spies or infiltrators. Why? Well, think about it. If the theory can never be wrong, then the person pointing out the flaws has to be an enemy. Admitting a critic is right means admitting the fundamental laws of history are wrong, and the ideology just cannot permit that. The author argues that this dynamic makes horrific internal violence and purges completely inevitable. To really illustrate this, the text references some devastating internal purges, like Kompanyang Ahas in Mindanao during the 1980s. Thousands of their own loyal members were suddenly accused of being deep penetration agents. Hundreds were summarily executed. These were their own people. The author uses this tragic event to prove Karl Popper's gravest warning. An ideology that cannibalizes itself before admitting fault will always demand blood to protect its dogma. Paranoia completely replaced debate, and doubt was literally punished with death. Dr. Eco then contrasts this revolutionary framework directly with Popper's concept of the open society. The beauty of a democracy, despite all its messy flaws, is that it's fundamentally designed to admit its wrongs. We can enact piecemeal reform, we can vote out bad leaders, and we can course-correct without ever resorting to bloodshed. A utopian revolution, on the other hand, demands absolute perfection, and when that perfection inevitably fails, it demands violence to protect the illusion. So, the author's ultimate philosophical verdict becomes crystal clear here. Any ideology that cannot be corrected, any system that completely refuses to be falsified by reality, will eventually demand human sacrifice to protect itself. We're going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. If the revolution is not historically inevitable, and the core prophecy has repeatedly failed the test of reality, how many more lives will be sacrificed before the ideology finally admits it was wrong? It's a really profound question about the balance between rigid dogma and the absolute sanctity of human life. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning and keep learning.